Sometimes we spend our lives building rockets, rewriting the future, inventing technologies no one thought possible, and at the end of the day, we still feel that human need, the raw, unfiltered need for connection, not algorithms, not ideas, not flights to Mars, but you. And when someone says, "Don't go, I can't live without you," that isn't weakness, that's honesty. That's gravity pulling us back to what truly matters. Sometimes people think that progress is about speed, about moving faster than everyone else, about winning, about being first. But real progress is about meaning. And meaning doesn't come from machines or numbers or market caps. It comes from people, from connection, from that quiet moment when the world stops making sense because someone you care about is walking away. I've spent a lot of my life trying to solve hard problems that don't care about feelings, problems that only respond to logic, physics, engineering. Rockets don't listen to excuses. Systems don't respond to emotion. You either get the math right or you don't. And for a long time, I believed that if you could just focus hard enough, work long enough, push far enough into the future, you could outrun everything else. Pain, loneliness, fear, loss. But there's one thing you can't outrun, and that's the human need to belong to someone. You can build things that fly. You can build things that think. You can build things that change the world. And still, at the end of the day, you can sit in a quiet room and realize that none of it fills the space where one person used to be. That's a strange realization, especially if you've trained yourself to believe that everything has a solution. Because this doesn't feel like a problem you can solve. It feels like a truth you have to face. When someone says, "Don't go," what they're really saying is, "You are part of my structure. You are part of how I function." And when they say, "I can't live without you," it's not dependency, it's acknowledgement. It's the recognition that humans are not designed as standalone systems. We are networks. We are interconnected. Remove a critical node, and everything else destabilizes. People misunderstand strength. They think strength is silence, control, distance. But real strength is being willing to say the thing that makes you vulnerable. To admit that for all the control you try to maintain, there are parts of life that matter so much they can break you. Love is one of those things. I've seen failure in many forms. Explosions, crashes, public skepticism, moments where logic said, "This probably won't work." But emotional failure is different. It doesn't explode all at once. It erodes you slowly. It shows up in the pauses between thoughts, in the lack of excitement for things that used to matter, in the realization that success feels quieter when there's no one to share it with. The truth is, building the future is easier than sustaining a relationship. The future doesn't ask you to listen. People do. The future doesn't ask you to compromise. Love does. The future doesn't look at you and ask you to be present when you're exhausted. A person does. And yet, without that person, the future feels thin. We talk a lot about purpose, about mission, about impact. But purpose without connection becomes abstract. It becomes something you chase instead of something you live. When someone you love is beside you, purpose becomes grounded. It becomes human. You're not just building for the world, you're building for us. There's a misconception that to achieve extraordinary things, you have to detach from ordinary emotions. That caring too much makes you weak. That attachment slows you down. I don't believe that anymore. Caring deeply doesn't slow you down, it gives direction to your momentum. It tells you why you're moving instead of just how fast. When someone leaves, it doesn't just change your present, it rewrites your future. Plans that once made sense suddenly feel misaligned. Achievements feel hollow. You realize that the equation you were solving was missing a variable the entire time. And no matter how elegant the rest of the solution is, without that variable, it's incomplete. So when I say don't go, it's not a dramatic plea. It's a statement of reality. It's saying the system works better when you're here. Life works better when you're here. I work better when you're here. And when I say I can't live without you, I don't mean life would stop biologically. I mean it would lose coherence. Meaning isn't about survival, it's about resonance. And some people resonate with you in a way nothing else does. We're taught to be self-sufficient, to rely on ourselves, to optimize independence. But there's a difference between independence and isolation. One is empowering, the other is empty. Humans evolved to cooperate, to bond, to attach. Pretending otherwise doesn't make you advanced, it makes you lonely. If you've ever tried to ignore that feeling, you know it doesn't go away. You can distract yourself, you can stay busy, you can surround yourself with noise, but the signals is still there, quiet, persistent, reminding you that connection is not optional, it's foundational. I don't think love is irrational. I think it's one of the most rational forces we have. It aligns behavior, it increases resilience, it gives context to suffering. People endure extraordinary hardship not for ideas but for people. That tells you something important. And yes, loving someone means risk, it means exposure, it means accepting that something valuable can be lost, but avoiding that risk doesn't protect you. It just guarantees a different kind of loss, the loss of depth, of color, of meaning. When someone walks away, there's a moment where pride tells you to stay silent, to let them go, to prove that you're fine on your own. But honesty asks a different question. What is actually true? And if the truth is that their presence matters deeply, fundamentally, then saying nothing isn't strength, it's avoidance. So this is me choosing truth, not because it's easy, not because it's safe, but because it's real. If you're listening to this, understand something. No amount of achievement replaces being chosen. No innovation replaces being understood. No future replaces a person who makes the present feel complete. I don't need perfection. I don't need certainty. I don't need guarantees. What I need is connection. What I need is you here, not as an idea, not as a memory, but as a living part of my life. The universe is vast, cold, indifferent. We create warmth through relationships, through love, through staying when leaving would be easier, through choosing each other again and again, even when it's hard. So if you're standing at the edge, thinking about walking away, hear this clearly, your absence will be felt. Not as drama, not as chaos, but as a quiet, persistent imbalance. And if there's even a part of you that feels the same pull, the same gravity, then maybe that's worth listening to. Don't go. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because life with you is more meaningful, more grounded, more real. And in the end, meaning is the most advanced technology we have. There's a moment that comes when everything slows down, not because the world stops moving, but because your mind finally does. The noise fades, the schedules don't matter, the achievements don't speak. And in that silence, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Some things are more essential than progress. Some things are more necessary than momentum. Some things are worth stopping for. I've always believed that the future is something you build, brick by brick, decision by decision, failure by failure. You don't wait for it, you engineer it. But what I didn't fully understand for a long time is that while the future can be built, connection has to be maintained. It doesn't survive on ambition alone. It requires presence, attention, choice. You can solve complex problems by isolating variables, by removing noise, by simplifying systems. But human relationships don't work that way. You can't strip them down without losing what makes them function. You can't optimize love the way you optimize a machine. The moment you try, you break it. There's a strange contradiction in being driven. The same focus that allows you to move mountains can also blind you to what's right in front of you. You start thinking that time is something you'll have later, that people will understand, that what matters now is forward motion. And then one day you realize that forward motion doesn't mean much if no one is walking beside you. When someone leaves, it forces a recalculation, not just emotionally, but existentially. You start reevaluating assumptions you didn't even know you were making. You assumed they'd be there. You assumed there was more time. You assumed that love, once established, was stable. But stability isn't passive, it's active. It's something you protect. People often confuse independence with invulnerability. They think needing someone means you're incomplete. I don't see it that way. I think recognizing that someone matters to your life is a form of clarity. It's acknowledging reality instead of pretending you're unaffected. Every complex system depends on key components. Remove one and performance degrades. That's not weakness, that's design. When I say, don't go, it's not about fear. It's about alignment. It's about recognizing that the trajectory of my life made more sense when you were part of it. That decisions felt grounded. That effort felt purposeful. That success felt shared. Without that, everything still works, but it works colder, sharper, less forgiving. I've learned that loneliness doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like efficiency without joy, like motion without meaning. You keep going because you're good at going, but something fundamental is missing, and no amount of productivity replaces it. We don't talk enough about the emotional cost of building things that matter, of carrying responsibility, of being the one who doesn't get to fall apart publicly. You learn to compartmentalize, to absorb pressure, to keep moving. But emotions don't disappear just because you ignore them. They accumulate. And eventually they demand attention. Love has a way of cutting through all that. It doesn't care how capable you are. It doesn't care how strong you look. It exposes the parts of you that aren't optimized, that aren't efficient, that aren't in control. And that's exactly why it matters. If you've ever tried to replace love with achievement, you already know it doesn't work. You can stand at the peak of something extraordinary and still feel empty. Because fulfillment isn't about altitude, it's about connection. When someone says they can't live without you, it's easy to misinterpret that as pressure, as burden. But more often it's trust. It's saying, you are integrated into my sense of reality. You matter beyond convenience, beyond circumstance. That's not something to dismiss lightly. Walking away is easy, staying is hard. Staying means confronting discomfort. It means negotiating differences. It means admitting mistakes. It means choosing the same person even when the version of them in front of you isn't ideal. But nothing meaningful is built without friction. Smooth surfaces don't hold together under stress. I've seen systems fail because someone assumed they were finished when they were only fragile. Relationships are the same. They don't end because they're impossible. They end because they're neglected, misunderstood, or deprioritized. And often, by the time that's clear, distance is already formed. Distance is dangerous. Not because of space, but because of silence. Silence allows stories to replace conversations, assumptions to replace understanding, pride to replace honesty. And once that happens, even people who still care deeply can drift apart without ever intending to. That's why speaking matters. Not perfectly, not eloquently, just truthfully. Saying, I need you, doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're paying attention. Saying, I can't do this alone, doesn't make you weak. It makes you accurate. Every meaningful endeavor in human history has been collaborative. Why would life itself be any different? There's also this myth that love should be effortless. That if it's right, it won't be hard. That's nonsense. Anything that matters is hard. Anything that lasts requires work. Maintenance isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign of value. If you're listening to this and thinking about leaving or being left, understand this, the pain you're feeling isn't proof that something is broken beyond repair. It's proof that it mattered. And things that matter deserve clarity before conclusion. I don't believe in chasing people who don't want to stay, but I do believe in honesty before acceptance. I believe in making sure the truth is spoken before silence becomes permanent. Regret lasts longer than discomfort. So this is me choosing discomfort, choosing vulnerability, choosing to say what's real instead of what's safe. Life without you would continue. Projects would move forward. Time would pass. But something essential would be gone, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a constant background signal disappearing. And once it's gone, you don't notice it immediately. But over time, you realize how much it guided you. We talk about building futures, but futures are only worth building if there's someone to experience them with. Otherwise, they're just structures without inhabitants. Impressive, but empty. I don't want perfection. I don't want guarantees. I don't want an idealized version of anything. I want reality. I want effort. I want presence. I want the kind of connection that doesn't disappear when things get complicated. So if there's still something here, something unresolved, unfinished, unspoken, then maybe walking away isn't the answer yet. Maybe the harder, braver choice is to stay and figure it out. Don't go because you think leaving is strength. Strength is facing what matters and not turning away. And if you choose to stay, it won't be because life is easy. It will be because it's meaningful. And meaning, in the end, is what makes everything else worth doing. There's a misconception that clarity comes from certainty, that once you know where you're going, everything else falls into place. But in reality, clarity often comes from loss, from the moment you realize that something you assumed was stable isn't. That something you thought would always be there suddenly isn't guaranteed. That's when you start asking better questions. I've spent most of my life focused on forward motion, on what's next, on how to make systems better, faster, more resilient. You learn to think that way when the problems you work on are unforgiving, when mistakes are expensive, when hesitation costs more than failure. Over time, that mindset becomes default. You apply it everywhere, even where it doesn't belong. Because people are not systems. People don't respond well to optimization. They don't behave according to clean equations. They change. They react. They feel things that don't always make sense in the moment. And if you treat relationships the way you treat problems, something to solve later, something that will hold steady while you focus elsewhere, you eventually discover that they don't. When someone begins to drift away, it doesn't happen all at once. There's no alarm, no sudden collapse. It's incremental. Small pauses where there used to be conversation, delays where there used to be immediacy, distance disguised as understanding. And because you're busy, because you assume stability, you tell yourself you'll address it later. Later is a dangerous assumption, because later is where regret lives. There's a point where you realize that your life still functions, but it no longer feels aligned. You're moving but not centered. Producing but not fulfilled. Everything looks fine from the outside, yet internally something essential is missing. And you can't fix that with effort alone. That's when the idea of someone leaving stops being abstract. It becomes real when you imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that the person who anchored your sense of home is no longer there. Not physically, maybe, but emotionally, that's when the weight hits, not as panic, but as gravity, a slow, undeniable pull that forces you to confront what actually matters. When I say, don't go, it's not impulsive, it's not emotional chaos, it's a considered conclusion. It's the result of running every scenario and realizing that the version of life without you consistently performs worse. Less coherence, less meaning, less signal, There's this belief that needing someone makes you dependent. That admitting you can't live without someone is surrender. I don't see it that way. I see it as acknowledging reality. Just like you acknowledge that certain components are mission critical, remove them and the entire system degrades. Not catastrophically, but enough that it never quite works the same again. You don't notice it at first. That's the dangerous part. You tell yourself you're fine. You stay productive, you meet expectations, but slowly motivation shifts from inspiration to obligation. From curiosity to habit, you keep going, but you're no longer pulled forward by anything meaningful. Love isn't about comfort, it's about orientation. It gives your effort direction. Without it, everything becomes harder to justify. People underestimate how much emotional connection stabilizes decision making. When you know someone is there, truly there, it changes how you think about risk, sacrifice, and endurance. You're not just building for outcomes, you're building for someone. And that changes the calculus. When that presence disappears, everything becomes heavier. Not because the work is harder, but because the why is thinner. I've learned that loneliness doesn't always announce itself as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as detachment, as indifference, as a quiet loss of excitement for things that used to matter. And that's far more dangerous because it feels manageable. Until it isn't. If you're honest with yourself, you know when someone matters beyond logic. You know when their absence would leave a permanent distortion. That's not something you reason your way out of. That's something you either face or suppress. Suppression works temporarily. It always does, but it extracts interest later. There's also the illusion of self-sufficiency, the idea that if you're capable enough, driven enough, intelligent enough, you don't need emotional reliance. That's appealing. It feels clean, efficient, but it's false. Every meaningful human experience is relational. Even the act of creating something impactful is, at its core, an attempt to connect. We're built to impress ourselves. We build to matter to others. So when someone you care about considers leaving, it forces you to confront something uncomfortable, that success doesn't protect you from loss. That intelligence doesn't insulate you from attachment. That achievement doesn't replace intimacy. And maybe that's the point. Because if nothing mattered enough to hurt, nothing would matter enough to motivate either. There's courage in saying nothing, and there's courage in saying everything. Most people choose silence because it feels safer, because it preserves dignity, because it avoids rejection. But silence also removes the possibility of repair, and once becomes permanent, the outcome is decided without ever being discussed. I don't want that. I'd rather face the risk of honesty than live with the certainty of regret. I'd rather say what's true and accept the outcome than pretend indifference and carry the consequences quietly. When I say I can't live without you, I'm not asking for rescue, I'm stating impact. I'm acknowledging that your presence changed the structure of my life in a way that can't simply be reversed, that you became part of how I understand the world, and losing that isn't trivial. Life would continue. Of course it would. But continuation isn't the same as fulfillment. Survival isn't the same as meaning. And I'm not interested in building a life that merely functions. I want a life that resonates. That resonance comes from shared experience, from knowing that someone understands not just what you do, but why you do it, from having someone who sees you not as a role or a title or a set of outcomes, but as a person navigating uncertainty. That kind of connection isn't replaceable, it's not interchangeable. It doesn't come from abundance. It comes from specificity, from history, from shared context. Walking away from that should never be casual. So this is me slowing down, not because I'm lost, but because this matters enough to stop for, because in the rush to move forward, it's easy to forget that some things don't move with you automatically. They require intention. If we're standing on the edge, weighing distance against effort. Understand this effort is temporary. Distance tends to be permanent. Once two people accept separation, the inertia sets in, not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped choosing. Choice is everything. Staying is a choice. Speaking is a choice. Being honest is a choice. None of them guarantee success, but they guarantee integrity. I don't need certainty about the future. I don't need assurance that everything will be easy. I just need the chance to choose you with clarity, to know that we didn't abandon something meaningful without understanding its value. So don't go, not because life would end, but because it would lose something essential, something that can't be rebuilt once it's gone. And if you decide to stay, it won't be because of pressure. It will be because you recognize the same truth, that what we have is worth the complexity, the effort, the work. The universe is chaotic, entropy is inevitable, but meaning is something we actively create. And love, real love, is one of the few forces that actually pushes back against that chaos. I'm choosing that. I hope you do too. There's a moment when you realize that speed isn't always progress. That moving forward doesn't always mean moving closer to what matters. Sometimes it just means you're putting more distance between yourself and something important without noticing it. That realization doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, usually when you stop long enough to actually listen to yourself. I've always believed that problems exist to be solved, that if something isn't working, you analyze it, break it down, remove assumptions, rebuild it stronger. That approach works remarkably well for complex systems, for engineering challenges, for things governed by rules. But there's a category of problems that doesn't respond the same way. Ones that don't get better just because you apply more force or more intelligence. Human connection is one of those. You can be precise, you can be disciplined, you can be relentless, and still lose something that mattered because you assumed it would wait, because you assumed it was stable, because you assumed that intention alone was enough. It isn't. Intention without attention decays. When someone starts to pull away, the instinct is to rationalize it, to tell yourself it's temporary. That timing is the issue, that once things slow down, once pressure lifts, once the future is more secure, everything will realign. That logic feels comforting because it lets you delay the uncomfortable conversation. But comfort isn't the same as accuracy. Distance doesn't usually come from a single decision. It comes from a series of small moments where presence was replaced by priority, where listening was replaced by assumption, where effort was postponed because it felt inefficient in the moment. Efficiency is a dangerous metric when applied to relationships. I've learned that some of the most important things in life don't scale well. They require disproportionate effort for seemingly small returns. They demand time without measurable output. They require you to be there even when you're exhausted, distracted, or unsure. And that can feel irrational if you're wired to optimize everything. But meaning doesn't come from optimization. It comes from commitment. When I say, don't go, it's not an emotional reaction. It's not fear. It's not a loss of control. It's the result of slowing down long enough to notice that the system isn't functioning the way it used to. That something essential is destabilizing, and ignoring that signal doesn't make it go away. You can survive almost anything by adapting. Humans are remarkably good at that. But survival isn't the same as alignment. You can adapt to absence and still feel the loss every day. You can adjust to silence and still remember what conversation felt like. You can function without someone and still know that something irreplaceable is missing. That's what people misunderstand when they hear, I can't live without you. They think it's exaggeration, dependence, drama. But often it's none of those things. It's simply acknowledging that Life without certain connections becomes narrower, less dimensional, less alive. We talk a lot about resilience, about standing on your own, about not needing anyone, but that idea ignores a basic truth: the most resilient systems are not isolated. They're interconnected. Redundancy doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being supported. When you remove support, you don't collapse immediately. You degrade slowly, quietly, until one day you realize you've been operating at a fraction of your capacity for a long time. I've experienced what it's like to be surrounded by activity and still feel alone, to be engaged constantly and still feel disconnected. That kind of loneliness is subtle. It doesn't demand attention. It just drains you over time. And when you trace it back, it often leads to the same place, a connection that wasn't maintained because it was assumed. Assumptions are efficient. They're also dangerous. Assuming someone understands you without checking, assuming they'll stay without reassurance, assuming your intentions are obvious without expression. None of those assumptions hold under stress, and life applies stress relentlessly. I don't believe that love is fragile. I believe it's demanding. It requires clarity. It requires communication. It requires effort even when effort feels inconvenient. And when those things disappear, love doesn't explode, it fades. Fading is harder to notice than breaking. That's why saying something matters, even if it's late, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you don't know how it will be received. Silence protects pride, but it sacrifices possibility. When I choose to speak, I'm not asking for certainty. I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for presence, for honesty, for the chance to recalibrate before the distance becomes permanent. Because once someone leaves emotionally, returning is much harder than staying would have been. There's a cost to vulnerability. Rejection is one. But there's also a cost to restraint. Regret is another. And regret compounds. It doesn't resolve itself over time. It waits. I'd rather face the immediate discomfort of honesty than the long-term erosion of unspoken truth. At least honesty respects the significance of what existed. When someone mattered to you enough to disrupt your focus, enough to alter your trajectory, enough to change how you experience the world, they deserve to know that, even if the outcome isn't what you hope for. Walking away without acknowledgement doesn't make you strong. It just makes the ending incomplete. Life is full of trade-offs. You can protect yourself, or you can be real. You can stay composed, or you can be sincere. You can avoid pain now, or you can avoid regret later. None of those options are risk-free. You just choose which risk you're willing to carry. I'm willing to carry the risk of saying this matters, because it does. He mattered in ways that weren't obvious at first, in ways that revealed themselves over time, in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly but changed everything quietly. And those are usually the most important things. The future is uncertain. It always is. No amount of planning removes that. But uncertainty shared feels different from uncertainty faced alone. It feels manageable, grounded, human. I don't want a future that looks impressive from the outside, but feels empty on the inside. I don't want progress that costs connection. I don't want success that requires emotional absence. If staying means work, that's acceptable. If it means uncomfortable conversations, that's acceptable. If it means recalibration, adjustment, effort, that's acceptable too, because the alternative isn't ease, it's loss. And loss doesn't always hurt loudly. Sometimes it just removes color from things that used to matter. So this is me choosing color, choosing depth, choosing the harder path because it leads to something real. Don't go, not because leaving would destroy everything, but because staying still has potential, because what we had wasn't accidental, because it shaped something meaningful, and because walking away without understanding that would be the real failure. Whatever happens after this, At least it will be honest. At least it will be complete. And sometimes that's the most rational choice you can make. There's a certain kind of silence that only appears when something important is slipping away. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt your day or demand attention. It just sits there, quietly reshaping everything. You notice it when conversations feel shorter, when pauses last longer, when presence becomes optional instead of assumed. And if you're not careful, you mistake that silence for stability. For a long time, I believed that focus was the highest virtue, that if you committed fully to a mission, everything else would align around it, that people would understand, that relationships could be paused, stretched, resumed later. That belief comes from working on problems that punish hesitation and reward intensity. You learn that momentum matters. You learn that stopping can be costly, and over time, you apply that logic everywhere. But not everything responds to momentum. Some things require stillness. Some things require repetition. Some things require choosing the same direction even when progress isn't visible. Human connection is one of those things. It doesn't grow just because you intend for it to. It grows because you show up consistently, imperfectly, present. When someone begins to leave, the instinct is to analyze, to look for causes, variables, timing issues, to assume it's circumstantial, temporary, fixable later. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes later never arrives because later depends on two people choosing to stay engaged, not one person assuming the other will. Assumptions feel efficient. They save time, they reduce friction. But they also replace curiosity. And once curiosity is gone, understanding follows. I've learned that relationships don't usually end because of a single failure. They end because of accumulated neglect, because moments that mattered were postponed, because conversations that were necessary were avoided, because presence was replaced with productivity. None of that feels dramatic while it's happening. It only becomes obvious in hindsight. When I say, don't go, it isn't reactive, it's reflective. It's the result of noticing that something essential is destabilizing, that the internal alignment I relied on is shifting, that the version of life where you're absent consistently underperforms the version where you're present. People often misunderstand statements like, I can't live without you. They hear dependence, they hear weakness, they hear fear. But that interpretation misses the point. It's not about survival. It's about coherence. It's about recognizing that certain connections integrate so deeply into your life that removing them changes the entire structure. You don't collapse without them, you adapt. But adaptation isn't the same as thriving. It's a reduced state, functional but diminished. I've seen systems that continue to operate after losing a key component. They don't fail immediately. They just become less efficient, less resilient, more brittle. Over time, the degradation compounds. That's what emotional loss looks like. Quiet erosion rather than sudden collapse. There's also this idea that strength means self-sufficiency, that needing someone compromises autonomy. I don't agree with that. True autonomy comes from choice, not isolation. Choosing to build something with someone doesn't reduce you. It expands you. It adds perspective. It introduces feedback. It grounds you. Without that grounding, it's easy to drift, to confuse motion with direction, to mistake activity for purpose. Loneliness doesn't always feel like sadness. Sometimes it feels like neutrality. Like nothing is wrong, but nothing is right either. You keep going because that's what you do. You achieve. You execute. But something fundamental is missing, and no amount of accomplishment fills that space. If you're honest, you know the difference between someone who was optional and someone who was foundational. Optional people add value. Foundational people shape the structure. Losing the first is disappointing. Losing the second changes everything. When someone is foundational, their absence doesn't just affect how you feel, It affects how you think, how you decide, how you interpret success and failure. They become part of your internal reference system. And when that disappears, everything else feels slightly off. That's why speaking matters, not because it guarantees an outcome, but because it respects the significance of what existed. Silence might preserve dignity, but it erases possibility. And once possibility is gone, so is repair. I don't believe in chasing what doesn't want to stay, but I do believe in clarity before closure, in honesty before acceptance, in making sure that something meaningful doesn't end simply because it was neglected rather than understood. There's risk in saying this out loud, there always is. Vulnerability exposes you to rejection, to misunderstanding, to loss of control, but restraint carries risk too. The risk of living with unanswered questions, the risk of replaying moments and wondering what might have happened if you'd spoken sooner. Regret is inefficient. It consumes resources without producing anything useful. So I choose inefficiency in the moment to avoid waste in the long run. I choose discomfort now over erosion later. Life is complex. People are complex. There are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs. You decide which cost you're willing to accept. Silence has a cost. Distance has a cost. Pretending indifference has a cost. None of them are free. When I imagine a future without you, it's not empty, it's just quieter, less dimensional, less anchored. Things still work. Projects still move. Time still passes. The internal signal that made all feel meaningful is weaker. That matters. I don't need certainty about outcomes. I don't need promises. I don't need everything resolved immediately. What I need is acknowledgement. Recognition that what we had mattered enough to pause for, enough to examine, enough to fight for if it's still there. Leaving without doing that doesn't make you strong. It just leaves the story unfinished. Staying doesn't guarantee success, but it keeps the possibility alive, and possibility is where meaning lives. If effort is required, that's acceptable. If change is required, that's acceptable. If growth is uncomfortable, that's acceptable too. Nothing worth building avoids discomfort. The question isn't whether it's hard. The question is whether it's worth it, and this was worth it. Worth the time, worth the energy, worth the vulnerability, worth the risk of being misunderstood. Don't go, not because life would end, but because something rare would, something that added depth instead of noise. Something that brought clarity instead of distraction. Something that made the complexity of the world feel manageable. Whatever happens next, let it happen with honesty. Let it happen with understanding. Let it happen with respect for what existed. Because in the end, progress isn't just about moving forward. It's about knowing when something matters enough to stop, turn around, and choose it again. That choice is where meaning begins. There's a point where you stop asking how fast you're moving and start asking whether you're moving in the right direction at all. That question doesn't come when things are falling apart. It comes when things are functioning well enough to hide what's missing. When productivity is high, when momentum is intact, when from the outside everything looks fine, that's when it's most dangerous to ignore. I've spent years believing that forward motion solves most problems. That if you keep building, keep iterating, keep pushing, the rest will align behind you. And in many cases, that's true. Systems reward persistence. Progress compounds. But there's a category of things that don't benefit from acceleration. Things that don't improve just because you're busy. Human connection is one of those things. It doesn't scale. It doesn't optimize. It doesn't respond to force. It responds to presence. And presence requires something that ambition often deprioritizes: attention. Attention isn't passive. It's a decision. A repeated one. And when attention shifts elsewhere for too long, connection doesn't fail loudly. It fades quietly. You don't notice it at first because there's no immediate penalty. just a slight loss of warmth, a subtle delay, a growing distance that feels manageable until it isn't. When someone starts to go, it's rarely sudden, it's incremental. It's the accumulation of moments where being there mattered more than being productive, where listening mattered more than explaining, where slowing down would have preserved something that speed slowly eroded. Speed can be impressive. It can also be careless. I've learned that you can be incredibly disciplined and still be inattentive. You can be committed to a future and still neglect the present. You can be building something extraordinary while quietly losing something irreplaceable. Those things are not mutually exclusive. When I say, don't go, it's not because I'm afraid of being alone. It's because I've done the math. I've examined the outcomes. And the version of life where you're gone consistently has less depth, less clarity. It still functions, but it doesn't resonate. People misunderstand statements like, I can't live without you. They hear emotion instead of assessment. But sometimes it's simply an acknowledgement of impact, of integration, of the way certain people become part of how you interpret reality. Remove them, and the whole model has to be rebuilt. You don't fail without them, you adapt. But adaptation is a reduced state. It's survival, not optimization. And I'm not interested in merely surviving a life that once felt whole. There's a myth that needing someone is a liability. That dependence weakens you. I don't agree. Unacknowledged dependence is dangerous. Acknowledged connection is stabilizing. Knowing what matters to you doesn't limit you. It gives you a reference point. It keeps you oriented. Without orientation, motion becomes noise. I've seen what happens when orientation disappears. You stay active, but your decisions feel less grounded. You chase outcomes, but they don't satisfy you the way they used to. You achieve things and immediately move on because the internal reward system isn't calibrated anymore. That's not burnout. That's disconnection. Disconnection doesn't always hurt. Sometimes it just dulls everything. And dullness is harder to detect than pain. If you've ever felt that neutral emptiness where nothing is wrong but nothing feels right, you understand how dangerous it is, because it convinces you that everything is acceptable when in reality something essential is missing. When someone mattered enough to shape your internal landscape, losing them doesn't just change how you feel. It changes how you think, how you weigh decisions, how you imagine the future. They become part of your cognitive framework. And frameworks don't dissolve cleanly. That's why silence isn't neutral. Silence is a choice. It allows distance to solidify. It allows misunderstanding to replace dialogue. It allows pride to override curiosity. And once that happens, even people who still care deeply can drift beyond reach. I don't want that. I'd rather risk honesty than guarantee regret. I'd rather say what's true than preserve the illusion of control. Control is overrated anyway. Most of the things that matter most in life aren't controllable. They're choosable. Choosing someone isn't about certainty. It's about commitment in the presence of uncertainty. It's about deciding that something matters enough to work through complexity instead of walking away from it. Walking away is easy. It requires no explanation, no vulnerability, no adjustment. Staying is harder. Staying demands effort when motivation fluctuates. It demands communication when silence feels simpler. It demands humility when ego wants distance. But nothing meaningful is built without sustained effort. We accept that truth everywhere else. We know systems degrade without maintenance. We know structures fail without reinforcement. We know performance declines without feedback. Yet somehow we expect relationships to survive on intention alone. They don't. They survive on action. If you're listening to this and wondering whether something is worth holding on to, consider this. Absence is permanent far more often than effort is exhausting. Effort has a cost, but it also has a return. Absence just compounds loss. I don't need guarantees. I don't need certainty about where this leads. I don't need perfection. What I need is engagement, the willingness to be present, the courage to have uncomfortable conversations instead of avoiding them, because avoiding discomfort